Listen carefully, because this might change how you see yourself forever. If someone can ignore you, walk away from you, treat you like you don't matter, then the real problem isn't them, it's what you allow. The moment you stop chasing, everything begins to change in ways most people don't expect. When you constantly reach out, double text, wait for replies, and try to hold someone's attention, you slowly give away your power without even realizing it. You start to shape your day around their responses, your mood around their behavior, and your worth around how much they acknowledge you. That's not connection, that's dependence. And people can feel that energy. When someone knows you'll always be there no matter how they act, they stop valuing your presence because it feels guaranteed. Human nature doesn't protect what feels permanent, it starts to overlook it. But the shift happens when you pull your energy back, not in a dramatic way, not to play games, but to genuinely refocus your attention on yourself. Instead of wondering why they haven't replied, you start investing that time into something that builds you, your goals, your health, your mindset, your peace. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop overthinking every word they said or didn't say, and slowly your energy becomes yours again. That's when things begin to feel different. You're no longer reacting, you're choosing. This is where your power returns. Because attention is currency. Where you place it determines what grows in your life. When you keep pouring it into someone who gives you little in return, you create imbalance. But when you redirect that attention inward, you restore that balance. You become more grounded, more confident, and less available for behavior that doesn't match your standards. People notice that shift, whether they admit it or not. The same person who ignored you begins to feel your absence because the easy access they once had is no longer there. It's not about making someone chase you. It's about no longer chasing anyone who doesn't meet you halfway. When you stop running after validation, you start standing in your value. And that changes everything about how people respond to you, because now they're not dealing with someone who needs attention. They're dealing with someone who chooses where to give it. Your silence carries more weight than any explanation you could ever give. When someone provokes you, ignores you, or treats you like you're optional, then that instinct is to respond, to defend yourself, to ask questions, to demand clarity. You want to be heard, understood, acknowledged. But the truth is, not every situation deserves your words. In fact, over-explaining often weakens your position because it shows you're seeking validation from someone who already chose not to give it. When you respond emotionally every time someone withdraws or disrespects you, you train them to believe they can control your reactions. They learn that your attention is always available, even when their behavior doesn't deserve it. But when you choose silence, you break that pattern completely. Silence creates space, and in that space, people are forced to confront their own actions without your input guiding the narrative. There's a different kind of strength in saying nothing. It shows that you're not desperate to be understood by someone who isn't trying to understand you. It shows that you're not willing to lower your standards just to keep a connection alive. Silence doesn't mean you're hurt or defeated. It means you're disciplined enough not to engage in situations that drain you. That level of control is rare, and it speaks louder than any emotional reaction ever could. When you stay silent, you also protect your energy. Not every message deserves a reply. Not every action deserves your attention. You begin to realize that your peace is more valuable than proving a point. And once you reach that mindset, your silence becomes intentional, not forced. It's no longer about ignoring someone to get a reaction. It's about choosing yourself without needing anyone else to notice. People often underestimate silence because it feels passive, but it's actually one of the most powerful responses you can give. It removes access, it removes emotional supply, and it shifts the dynamic completely. The person who once felt in control starts to question the change. They notice the absence of your reactions, your words, your presence. And in that absence, your value becomes clearer than it ever was when you were constantly trying to prove it. Setting standards changes the entire way people deal with you, because it shifts you from reacting emotionally to operating with intention. When you don't have clear standards, you end up responding based on feelings in the moment, excusing behavior, giving second chances too quickly, and tolerating things that quietly damage your self-respect. You might tell yourself you're being patient or understanding, but in reality, you're lowering the bar just to keep someone around. And once that becomes a pattern, people don't rise to meet you. They settle where you allow them to stand. Standards are different from rules you try to force on others. They're decisions you make about what you will and won't accept, regardless of who the person is. It's not about controlling someone's behavior. It's about controlling your response to it. When you decide that inconsistency, disrespect, or being ignored is not something you entertain, your actions begin to reflect that. You stop over-explaining, you stop chasing clarity, and you stop giving endless chances to people who show you the same patterns again and again. This is where your energy becomes selective. You're no longer available to everyone at all times. You become more observant, more patient, and more aware of how someone shows up rather than what they say. Words lose their power when they're not backed by actions, and standards help you see that clearly. Instead of getting pulled into emotional highs and lows, you stay grounded in what you've already decided you deserve. When you operate from standards, you don't need to argue, convince, or prove your worth. Your behavior does that for you. You naturally distance yourself from situations that don't align, and that distance speaks volumes. People quickly realize that access to you is not guaranteed. It's earned and maintained through respect and consistency. That realization alone changes how they approach you. Over time, this mindset strengthens your self-worth because you're no longer negotiating it. You're not adjusting your value based on someone else's attention or lack of it. You're steady, clear, and intentional. And when people see that you won't bend your standards for temporary emotions, they either rise to meet them or remove themselves. Either way, you win because you're no longer accepting less than what you've already decided is right for you. Walking away without announcing it is one of the clearest signs of self-respect. Most people feel the need to explain their departure, to give warnings, to express how hurt they are, or to hope the other person will finally understand and change. But the truth is, when someone has already shown you a pattern of ignoring or undervaluing you, explanations rarely create transformation. They create temporary guilt at best, and even that fades quickly if there are no real consequences. When you quietly remove yourself, you take your power back without asking for permission. You're no longer waiting for someone to agree with your decision or validate your feelings. You simply recognize what you've experienced and act accordingly. That kind of action is grounded, not emotional. It comes from clarity rather than frustration. And because there's no dramatic exit, no arguments, no final speeches, it leaves a stronger impact than any words ever could. Announcing your departure often gives the other person time to react, negotiate, or manipulate the situation. They may promise change, say what you want to hear, or pull you back in just enough to keep things the same. But when you move in silence, you remove that opportunity completely. Your absence becomes real, not theoretical. It's no longer something they can talk their way out of. It's something they have to feel. This approach also protects your dignity. You don't need to convince anyone of your worth or justify why you're stepping away. Your decision stands on its own. You're not leaving to prove a point. You're leaving because you've already learned the lesson. That mindset shifts everything. It turns your focus away from them and back onto yourself where it belongs. Over time, this builds a deeper level of confidence. You begin to trust your judgment without needing external confirmation. You understand that not every situation requires closure through conversation. Sometimes closure comes from the decision you make to no longer participate. And when that decision is carried out quietly and consistently, it speaks louder than any ultimatum ever could. Upgrading your life requires a shift in focus that most people resist at first because it demands accountability instead of excuses. It's easy to stay stuck in a cycle of explaining someone else's behavior, justifying why they ignored you, or holding on to the hope that they'll eventually change. But that mindset keeps you in the same place, waiting for someone else to become better instead of deciding to become better yourself. The real transformation begins when you stop analyzing them and start investing in you. Every moment you spend overthinking their actions is energy taken away from your own growth. That energy could be used to build your confidence, improve your skills, strengthen your mindset, or create a life that doesn't revolve around anyone's inconsistent attention. When you redirect that focus, you begin to see progress in areas that actually matter. You feel more in control, more grounded, and less emotionally dependent on how someone treats you. This isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's not about showing them what they lost or trying to trigger regret. It's about reaching a point where their opinion no longer defines your value. When you start upgrading your habits, your environment, and your standards, you naturally become someone who doesn't fit into the same situations you once tolerated. The things that used to confuse or hurt you begin to look clear and unacceptable. Growth also changes your perspective. You stop romanticizing potential and start paying attention to reality. You see people for who they are, not who you hoped they would become. That awareness makes it easier to detach because you're no longer holding on to illusions. You're grounded in truth, and that truth pushes you forward instead of holding you back. As you continue to elevate yourself, your confidence becomes internal rather than dependent. You don't need constant reassurance, attention, or validation to feel secure. You know your worth because you've built it through discipline and self-respect. And when you reach that level, your presence carries a different energy. One that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, and doesn't settle. It simply chooses what aligns and walks away from what doesn't without hesitation. Making someone feel the loss of you isn't about creating pain for them. It's about removing the version of you they took for granted. When you constantly show up, give attention, and remain available no matter how you're treated, your presence becomes predictable. And when something feels predictable, it often loses its value. People don't always recognize what they have when it's always there. They recognize it when it's no longer accessible. If you respond to being ignored with emotional reactions, long messages, or attempts to fix things, you keep yourself in a position where your value is overlooked. It signals that no matter what happens, you'll continue to invest. But when you stop reacting and start redirecting your energy, the dynamic shifts. You're no longer feeding the situation with attention, and that absence creates a gap they can feel. This is where the real realization begins, not because you told them, but because they experience it. They notice the lack of your presence, your effort, your consistency. The things they once overlooked become noticeable precisely because they're missing. It's not about disappearing to manipulate emotions. It's about choosing not to give where it's not appreciated. That distinction matters because one comes from insecurity while the other comes from self-respect. As you continue to focus on yourself, your life starts to expand beyond that one connection. You become more engaged in your own growth, your environment, and your peace. That shift makes it harder for anyone to have the same level of access they once did because your priorities have changed. You're no longer centered around their attention. You're centered around your own progress. Over time, this creates a clear contrast between what they had and what they lost. Not through words, not through confrontation, but through absence and growth. And whether they acknowledge it or not, the difference becomes evident. Because people may ignore your presence for a while, but they can't ignore the impact once it's gone.